Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on temperature control in endotherms. What we're going to be doing in this video, which is part of our Module 5 series, is having a look at the specification reference 5.1.1b, the physiological and behavioural responses involved in temperature control in endotherms. First thing then, let's define an endotherm. An endotherm is an organism that uses heat from metabolic reactions to maintain their body temperature. So these organisms are not reliant on the external sources of heat, because what they are doing is using these metabolic reactions to generate heat, which then they're going to utilise in maintaining body temperature. And in order to make sure that their body temperature stays within the acceptable range, they're going to use both behavioural and physiological adaptations. If we think about one key endotherm, us humans, then our core body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. Now, it's not exactly 37 degrees Celsius. There is, of course, a range here, and the actual range is given as 36.8 plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So do remember, wherever you see this little plus minus sign, that does mean that the actual range of temperature, if it's 36.8 plus or minus 0.5, could be 36.3 through to 37.3, because we're going half a degree below that and half a degree above that. If you've got a temperature above 38 degrees Celsius, that's indicative of a fever, and temperatures below 35 are hypothermia. So what we're really looking at here is above 38, below 35, generally not good. And the reason for that is that the enzymes in humans have an optimum temperature of around 37 degrees Celsius. So if we're going too low, they're obviously going to be reacting very slowly. If we go too high, there's the risk of them denaturing. Okay, let's delve into these different mechanisms that our endotherms are going to be utilising in order to avoid either overheating or getting too cold. We're going to start off with the mechanisms that are employed when the organism gets too hot. So the first region we're going to look at is the skin. And hopefully at GCSE you did talk about this process of vasodilation. So if we break that word down, vaso is to do with some kind of a blood vessel, and dilation is where things get wider. So vasodilation is basically the widening of a vessel. What we are going to make sure of is that at A level, we are going to be using the phrase arterioles dilate. So when we're talking vasodilation, we are talking about the arterioles, those little tiny arteries. Now, what we're going to find is that near the surface of the skin, what we have are those little arterioles. And if we are too hot, they are going to actually dilate. And the reason they do that is because if they're dilated, that means that they've widened their lumen, and therefore more blood is going to flow close to the surface of the skin. If more blood flows close to the surface, more heat is radiated from the skin to the surroundings. Do note I've given you a couple of little exam tips down here for this particular style of question. Number one, make sure you use the word arterioles, don't say other random things. And do not say that the vessels move closer to the surface. They're not moving closer to the surface. They were always at that same depth. The only thing they're doing is widening in order to allow a greater volume of blood to flow close to the surface. We need to obviously make sure we use the word arterioles as opposed to capillaries, because capillaries have that specialisation of only a single cell thick wall. Now, if a wall is only a single cell thick, they do not have muscle tissue, and if they don't have muscle tissue, they have no ability to contract or relax. So clearly capillaries are incapable of vasodilation because they do not have a muscle to relax. Arterioles, however, do have muscle tissue in their walls and therefore can undergo this process of either contraction or relaxation, and therefore can undergo vasodilation. The next bit in the skin that we're going to look at are the sweat glands. So you've got these sweat glands scattered throughout your skin, and that is going to then secrete sweat. Now the sweat is going to be released onto the surface of the skin itself, and heat from your body is then going to be transferred to that sweat, which leads to evaporation. And because obviously water has this high latent heat of vaporization, and remember, latent heat of vaporization is the amount of energy required to change that particular substance from a liquid to a gas, then we're going to be transferring a lot of energy from the body to the sweat to cause that evaporation, therefore reducing the internal body temperature. Now, again, you've got a little exam tip over here. Just make sure that you have the link in there. Don't just say that the evaporation is going to reduce body temperature. Make sure that we are saying that the body heat is used for that evaporation. Be explicit with it. The next bit on the skin that we may have, fur, hair or feathers. Any of those fluffy bits on the outside are going to have the ability to obviously trap air against the skin. So if we're too hot, the hair, the fur, the feathers are all going to lie flat against the skin surface. And they're going to do this because the erector muscles of the hair are going to relax. Now, when they're all flat against the skin, that means less air will be trapped against it, and air is a good insulator, so if we've got less air trapped, that means we've reduced the insulation. So more heat can be lost from the body at that point. When we're then considering what other things the body can do to reduce the temperature internally, then we've already talked about this idea of vasodilation, but we're also going to have dilation of blood vessels going to the extremities, those peripheral bits of the body, your hands, your feet, etc. And the reason that we're going to do that is we will then get a greater volume of blood going to those regions, which means we've got more heat being lost through the skin surface. We're also going to see some changes in the liver. So the liver is very metabolically active, and we will see that in other bits of Module 5. And what we're going to see here is we're going to reduce the amount of respiration occurring. Respiration is exergonic, and that means it releases heat energy, and therefore less respiration, less heat energy being released. Skeletal muscles will also contract less, and again ties into less respiration, therefore less heat energy being released. Some animals, not humans typically, are also going to utilise panting as a mechanism here. Now, dogs are a great example for this. If you've seen a dog on a hot day, they're going to be sitting around with their tongue hanging out and just panting away like there's no tomorrow. And the reason that they're doing that is because it's going to increase evaporation of water from the surface of their lungs and their airways. And just like we said previously, this evaporation of water is going to use heat from the body to actually cause that process of evaporation to take place. But it's not just those physiological changes that our organisms are going to employ. We also have behavioural modifications. So to be fair, you can just think about, what do you do when you get too hot? And I'm sure we can all think of some examples here. But we can apply this to a range of other endotherms as well, because they're all pretty similar in their behavioural actions. They're going to find some kind of shelter from the sun. They might go into a burrow. They might just go and sit in a shady area. Whatever it is, it's getting out of the sun first of all. Reducing surface area exposed to the sun, and a variety of ways that they can do that. Obviously, things like the hippos will submerge themselves. You've got other creatures that will cover themselves in mud and the like. They will reduce their activity. If you see any of these animals on super hot days, then they're generally just lying around not doing a whole lot. Spreading limbs out to increase their heat loss in that shaded area, and in some cases they'll also wet their skin. Elephants, great example of this. You can see the one in the bottom picture there, just spraying water all over itself, because if it's got wet skin, then it will transfer that heat energy from the body to cause that water to evaporate from the surface. Let's have a little contemplation about what happens when those organisms are now too cold. So physiological adaptations first of all, and you'll notice there's a bit of a theme that it's going to be the reverse of what happened when they were too hot, pretty much. So back to the skin, we get vasoconstriction. So vaso, obviously relating to the blood vessels. Constriction is if you constrict, you're narrowing something. So what we're seeing here, the arterioles are basically becoming narrowed. That means that we're going to reduce blood flow to the vessels on the skin surface and therefore reduce the heat being lost through radiation. Our sweat glands are going to release less sweat and therefore we have less evaporation, so less heat will be transferred to the water to cause that evaporation. Any hair, fur or feathers are going to then have those erector muscles contract. That makes the hairs stand on end, trapping air against the skin, and because air is a good insulator, that means less heat is going to be transferred to the surroundings. Those blood vessels leading to the extremities are going to constrict, and this is going to reduce the blood flow to those areas to reduce that heat loss. Now, this is obviously something that can be problematic if you think of people who have been in these very cold conditions and they get frostbite, for example. Think about the areas that are going black at those points. Their nose, their ears, fingertips, toes, all of those extremities are going to have reduced blood flow, and if the blood flow is reduced for too long a period, then clearly we're starving those cells of oxygen. They're not going to be able to survive for too long like that. In terms of the liver, we increase the rate of respiration to release more heat energy because it is an exergonic reaction. And our skeletal muscles are going to start to have spontaneous muscle contraction, also known as shivering. And what we're going to find is in order to actually shiver, we're going to have metabolic reactions occurring and therefore we release that heat. For animals that pant, they will pant less to reduce that evaporation from the lungs and the airways there. In terms of behavioural adaptations, what we're going to see, again, is the reverse. If you are cold, then you're going to go and find a sunny spot because that's always going to warm you up a little bit. You're going to increase the surface area of your body exposed to the sun and move around. You don't generally find organisms just standing still. Some organisms that live in very cold areas have got clever little behavioural adaptations. So if we think about little penguins down here, they huddle. And what they're going to do is in that little huddle, then they're going to actually circulate. So you don't have the same penguin stuck on the outside the whole time. They rotate round who's in the middle and who's on the outside, because that means we're reducing the surface area exposed to the external temperatures and we're reducing the heat loss of all of the organisms involved in the huddle. If we think about other animals, they curl up into a little ball like our little fox here, and if you've got a big fluffy tail you can wrap it around your nose as well, which is always a good idea. And of course they try to remain as dry as possible. So if we now think about some of these advantages and disadvantages of being an endotherm. If you are an endotherm, because we are utilising internal mechanisms to control our body temperature, then we tend to have a fairly constant body temperature, regardless of what the external temperature of the surroundings may be. Because of that, that gives us the ability to actually have habitats in a much wider range of the world, because we're no longer purely reliant on the external temperatures. If we then think about that link to predator and prey relationships, because we're not reliant on those external temperatures, even if it's cold, we can access food as a predator or escape from a predator if we are prey. There are some disadvantages though to being an endotherm. First one, hopefully quite obvious. If we've got all of these different things happening inside the body to control that body temperature, we're going to need more food, because a lot of that energy that we're taking in from the food is going to be used in those processes to maintain our body temperature. And there's also the risk of overheating in hot weather. Think of people that have suffered from things like heat stroke, for example. There is that risk to any animal. Also why you shouldn't walk your dog in the middle of the summer's day. You should only do it early in the morning, late at night. Otherwise, they're going to overheat and that can be life-threatening. So, How do we have these controls then? We've got the hypothalamus, part of the brain, and it's all to do with controlling different aspects of our body. If we're thinking about how it helps with the temperature control, we've got temperature receptors in the hypothalamus that are constantly monitoring the blood for any changes in your core body temperature. Now, in addition to those temperature receptors constantly monitoring the blood, there are two control centres associated: heat loss and the heat gain centre. Hopefully self-explanatory about what each is going to do. Those centres are going to send signals out to bring about those changes needed to control body temperature. Now, the method by which they're going to communicate with those different regions of the body varies. If we need a rapid response, we're going neuronal system. So we're going to use those electrical impulses being transmitted through our neurons. And these examples would be things like sweating, shivering, vasodilation, vasoconstriction. And all of those are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And we'll be having a look at the subdivisions of the nervous system later on in Module 5. If we want some longer term responses, it will of course be the hormonal system that we utilise. So think about things like thyroxine coming from your thyroid gland, adrenaline from the adrenal gland. So hormonal system we have a look at in more detail at a later part in Module 5 as well. In terms of what we're going to see as a result of the hypothalamus sending these signals, whether it be hormonal or neuronal, we're going to get changes in the skin, as we've already looked at in those examples, changes to the muscular contractions, and metabolism changes as well. And all of those things together are going to allow us to maintain a narrow range of acceptable temperatures within the endotherm's body. The last thing we need to consider are the peripheral temperature receptors. Now, peripheral generally means kind of like the edge or the outside. So what we're looking at here with peripheral temperature receptors are those that occur in the skin and the mucous membranes. And what they're going to be doing is monitoring the temperature of our extremities, the bits of the body basically on the very fringes, so fingers, toes, etc. And the reason that we're going to be monitoring what they are doing is because they are going to start to cool down or warm up before the core of your body. So your core is where we've got all those very important organs, all those vital organs. Your extremities are, to a certain extent, expendable. So what we see is they are more prone to those temperature changes. Now, that actually acts as a bonus to the body because they are going to act as basically early warning systems to the hypothalamus. So if those peripheral temperature receptors start detecting a temperature change, we can start to bring about those changes before it affects the core. And obviously that's critical because if your core body temperature is increasing or decreasing beyond the accepted range, that's where we're going to get in serious trouble. I hope you found this video useful, and of course don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can see when the next video is uploaded, and of course head on over to the website where you can find an array of other materials to help you in your A-level biology studies.